Good morning or afternoon, whatever time it is when you're watching this. I hope you've had a good respite from our regular class schedule with Easter break, and then hopefully you were able to make it to some of the talks for the capstone day. I really enjoyed watching the ones that I sat in on. So today we're going to start chapter 25 on the digestive system. We should be able to finish this chapter up on Monday, and then we'll be spending the remaining of our class time this semester on the reproductive systems. So our final exam will cover that part of chapter 24 on acid-base balance. It will also cover what we're going to go through in chapter 25 on the digestive system, and then on both the male and female reproductive system. Now, I want to make sure everyone has heard this. I mentioned this in lab this week, but I'm not going to go over the anatomy of the male and female reproductive system again in lecture, since we covered it pretty well in lab. But you still will be responsible for that on the final exam in lecture. So make sure you review the male and female reproductive anatomy. That's probably the easiest part of the reproductive system. The harder part is the physiology of the reproductive system, because that can get kind of complicated as it involves complex interaction between different hormones. So with that, let's get started on chapter 25. The digestive system carries out digestion, which is actually a whole series of processes that provide nourishment for the body. But this can be broken down into 5 different stages or processes. The first is ingestion, which involves the intake of food into the body. So this involves placing food in our mouth, masticating the food, which means to chew, and then swallowing. That's all part of ingestion. Second process is digestion. Digestion is the mechanical, chemical breakdown of food. This takes place in our oral cavity when we masticate our food, and the chemical breakdown actually starts while the food is still in our mouth, because when we chew our food, we mix it with saliva that's secreted by our salivary glands, and that contains salivary amylase as well as salivary lipase, which breaks down carbohydrates and fats. It's further broken down in the stomach, but mainly most of the chemical digestion takes place in the small intestines. So these 5 processes don't necessarily occur in this particular sequence, because there is some overlap between these processes basically in the timing of these processes. Once the food is digested, then it's absorbed. That's the uptake of nutrients into the body. That takes place in the mucosa of the small and large intestine, and that involves various cellular transport processes that we've talked about previously. Then the next process is compaction, which is the absorption of water, and the consolidation of waste into feces. That decreases the volume of the waste that we have to eliminate by defecation. And so defecation is the last process. That's the elimination of waste. And so digestion is actually a fairly complicated process, even though its overall function is just to provide nutrients which our body needs. So let's take a look at some of the general anatomy first. The digestive system can be divided into 2 subdivisions. The first is the digestive tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal. It's basically a muscular tube that extends all the way from our mouth clear to the anus. In a living person, the digestive tract is about 5 meters in length, but it's a lot longer in a cadaver because when a person dies, the smooth muscle that's in the walls of the digestive tract relax, and the length of the digestive tract actually increases. So it's a little less than half the length actually in a live person compared to what you see in a cadaver. So the digestive tract consists of the oral cavity, which contains a number of different organs related to digestion, the pharynx or throat, the esophagus, which is a tube that carries food from the pharynx down to the stomach, and then the stomach where food is stored and digested, the small intestine where further digestion and absorption of nutrients takes place, the large intestine where absorption of water and minerals takes place, and also compaction of feces and waste occurs in the large intestine, and then finally the anus, which through which the feces pass. In addition to this alimentary canal, there are also a number of accessory organs that aid in ingestion and also secretions of chemicals that break down food. Many of these are either exocrine glands, which produce secretions through a duct, or they are other organs like the tongue and the teeth that are involved with ingestion. So some of the accessory organs include the ones that I just mentioned, along with the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So the next part of the general structure of the gastrointestinal tract are the layers that make up the walls of this so-called alimentary canal or digestive tract. So it doesn't matter which region of the digestive tract you look at, all the parts of the digestive tract have the same 4 layers. The names of these 4 layers are always the same. The exact composition and appearance of these layers, though, does vary slightly from layer to layer. So the first layer, the deepest layer of the GI tract, is called the mucosa. The mucosa is the layer that's closest to the lumen, or the hollow portion of the tube through which the food passes. And it's made up of several layers, but the layer that is closest to the lumen is some form of epithelium. And now the exact type of epithelium varies depending on what part of the GI tract you look at. In the esophagus, for example, which is this just showing, the epithelium is a stratified squamous epithelium because in the esophagus, that's mainly just a protective layer, sort of like the skin that protects the walls of the esophagus. When you get into other areas of the digestive tract, like in the small and large intestine, that epithelium is thinner and it's only made up of 1 layer of cells. Specifically in those 2 regions, the epithelium is a simple columnar epithelium where absorption can take place. So just superficial to the epithelium, there's a thin layer of connective tissue called the lamina propria. And then just superficial to that is a very thin layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae. So that's the mucosa. Then if we go the next superficial layer, this lighter colored layer that you see here, which has some blood vessels in cross-section, is called the submucosa. The submucosa is made up mainly of loose connective tissue, but in some regions of the digestive tract it may also have glands that produce secretions that are released in the lumen of the of the digestive tract. For example, in the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, there are numerous duodenal glands that are located in the submucosa. So the submucosa of the duodenum has a very, very different appearance than the next region of the small intestine, which is called the jejunum, or the esophagus, for example. So you can sometimes tell what region of the digestive tract you're looking at in cross section, just based on what type of glands and other structures are located in some of these layers. So they do vary in appearance. Then the next layer is the muscularis externa. It's made up mainly of smooth muscle tissue, along with some nerves. There's a nerve plexus, a net-like nerve network in the muscularis externa that causes the peristaltic or wave-like contractions of the intestines that propel the food through the digestive tract. And it's actually a very, very extensive network. They estimate that there's more neurons in that mesenteric plexus than there is in the spinal cord. So, and it's thought to be actually a very ancient nerve network. Goes way back to hundreds of millions of years ago. Our ancestors had the same type of network in their digestive tract. So in most of the parts of the digestive system, the muscularis externa has two layers of smooth muscle. There's an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle, except for the stomach, because in the stomach there's three layers of smooth muscle. There's an inner circular layer, there's a middle longitudinal layer, and then there's an oblique layer of smooth muscle in the stomach. The stomach does a lot of churning in order to mix up the food with the hydrochloric acid that's secreted by the stomach, as well as digestive enzymes. And those three layers of smooth muscle in the stomach help it to churn and mix up the food a lot better with those digestive enzymes. Then finally, the outermost layer is the serosa. The serosa is a very thin layer of loose or aerial or connective tissue that surrounds the intestines and helps protect it. So it's kind of like the adventitia of the ureter, except in this case it's called the serosa. All right, so let's start out with the oral cavity. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go down through the digestive tract and take a look at all of the organs. So the mouth or oral cavity or buccal cavity contains a number of organs. It contains the teeth, which are actually organs because they're made up of more than one tissue type. Also the tongue. Tongue is a muscular organ that actually is a lot more important than what most people think. It helps to manipulate food so that we can chew it with our teeth, but yet our tongue stays out of the way so it doesn't get bitten, at least most of the time. And it also has numerous sensory receptors, so it can determine the temperature of the food that we ingest to make sure it's not too hot. Also, there's taste receptors to determine whether something might be poisonous, so we can reject it before it gets swallowed. So the tongue is really, tongue also helps in the swallowing. It moves food to the back of our throat where it can be swallowed. In addition, there are some salivary glands that are associated with the oral cavity that empty secretions through ducts into the oral cavity that help to moisten our food and add mucus to it to make it easier to swallow. And then there's also the hard palate, which separates our nasal cavity from our oral cavity. Now, humans have a type of dentition which refers to the the teeth of an organism that's called a heterodont dentition. Heterodont refers to animals that have teeth of different shapes. So the different types of teeth that we have are incisors, which are kind of chisel-like. They're designed for biting off chunks of food or nipping off pieces of food. There's canines, which are really, in most species, are designed for piercing, although they're much reduced in length in humans. And then there's premolars, which are designed for shearing or cutting. And then there are molars, which are designed for grinding. Some other types of animals, like fish and reptiles and amphibians, have what's called homodont dentition. They just have very simple cone-like teeth that are all pretty much similar to one another. But mammals are somewhat unique in that they have heterodont dentition. That's kind of one of the advantages that mammals have over reptiles and amphibians and fish. It allows us to process our food much more efficiently. In addition, humans also have what's called diffeodont dentition. Diffeodont dentition means that we have two different sets of teeth during our lifetime. We have one set of teeth that comes in shortly after birth, called deciduous teeth, or commonly called baby teeth, which are shed at different times. And then after the deciduous teeth are shed, then permanent teeth come in, grow into place. And biologists have a way of reporting the number of each of the different types of teeth that a mammal has. It's called a dental formula. And I put an example of the dental formula down here at the bottom of the screen for a human. So what the dental formula does is it shows the number of each type of tooth in order in both the upper and lower jaw, but only on one side of the jaw. So this would be like only on the left side or only on the right side. So the dental formula for humans, for example, is 2 over 2, 1 over 1, 2 over 2, 3 over 3. So the first fraction, 2 over 2, means that we have 2 upper and 2 lower incisors on each side of the jaw. So that's only one side. Then the 1 over 1 means we have just one canine tooth in the upper and lower jaw on just one side of the jaw. And then the 2 over 2 means we have 2 premolars in both the upper and lower jaws. And then the 3 over 3 means we have 3 molars in both the upper and lower jaws. And this is just on one side of the mouth, keep in mind. So if you add up all those numbers in both the upper and lower jaw on one side, you come up with a total of 16 teeth on the left and 16 teeth on the right. So to get the total number of teeth from the dental formula, you have to multiply the total, the sum of those numbers by 2. And if you do that for humans, you get a total of 32 teeth. However, there is some variation. Occasionally, a person will be born with an extra tooth or extra teeth. Those are called supernumerary teeth. Or sometimes a person will be born without a tooth. For example, I have one premolar in my upper jaw that is missing. And I didn't discover it until I went to a dentist when I was in my 20s. I was in graduate school, and the dentist said, "Hey, did you know you still have a baby tooth?" And I said, "No, I didn't." And he said, "Yeah, you have one of your teeth is still a deciduous tooth." And he said, "There's no permanent tooth underneath it." So that's why it's still there, because there was no permanent tooth to come in and push it out. And he said, in a few years, your mouth will probably start rejecting that deciduous tooth because they're not made to last a person's lifetime. And he said it'll probably get loose, and then eventually it'll fall out. So sure enough, a few years later, that tooth started getting loose, and it kind of started bothering me a little bit. So I went to the dentist, and um, dentist confirmed that yes, you don't have a permanent tooth underneath that. And so he went ahead and pulled it out, and then I had to have a bridge put in to replace that tooth. So there's a lot of variation like that. That's kind of aberrant variation, I guess. That's not normal. It's not uncommon, though, for people not to have their wisdom teeth in either their upper or lower jaw. Sometimes they just don't come in. And so sometimes some people only have two molars on each side of their upper or lower jaw instead of three. All right, now the next organ in the oral cavity is the tongue. The tongue is a muscular organ that has sensory receptors that is able to detect characteristics of our food, like texture and temperature, also different kinds of tastes. It helps us to manipulate our food so that it can be chewed. It also helps to push the food to the back of our mouth so it can be swallowed. And so it plays a very, very important role in ingestion. It also plays an important role in communication because our tongue, the movements of our tongue affect the sounds that we produce when we speak. So it helps us to enunciate. So it's actually a lot more important than probably most people think. I know I, for one, probably have taken my tongue for granted, and until you accidentally bite it, and then you realize how important it is, because that doesn't feel. In fact, I did that about a week ago, and when I went into class, I had a hard time speaking because I had this big bump on my tooth or on my tongue where I bit it, and it was kind of hard to talk. So I don't know if anybody noticed, but I could tell. All right. Oh, this one's kind of out of place. This is a longitudinal section through a tooth to show that it's really pretty complicated in structure. The tooth is divided up into two main parts. The part of the tooth that is above the gum is called the crown. That's the part of the tooth that you can see. And then the part of the tooth that's below the gum line is called the root. And the root anchors the tooth in the alveolus by way of the periodontal ligament, which is really a periosteum that's attached to the bone of our jaw on one side, and then it attaches to the root of the tooth on the other side. So that helps to hold the tooth in place. It does give it just a little bit of flexibility, but not so much that the tooth can come loose. Also, the tooth is made up of two different types of hard tissue. The outermost layer is made up of enamel, which is the hardest tissue in the body. It contains a mineral called hydroxyapatite that makes it very, very sturdy. And then there's a deeper layer called dentine. The dentine is a little bit softer than the outer enamel layer. In addition, there's a hollow cavity inside our teeth called the pulp cavity. The pulp cavity contains blood vessels and nerves because a tooth, just like a bone, is actually a living organ. And the roots are also have a hollow root canal, which allows nerves and blood vessels to penetrate the tooth. Because since the tooth is a living organ, it does have to have nutrients which are carried by the blood vessels. And it contains tooth so that we can be aware of what we're biting into, or if we're biting something really hard. All right, then another part of our oral cavity is the salivary glands. These are not really inside our oral cavity, but they're associated with them. They're located just superficial to our oral cavity. Salivary glands produce a secretion that contains another number of substances. It contains water as well as mucus. Mucus helps to bind and lubricates the food that we eat and aids in swallowing. It also contains some enzymes. It contains salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down starch. So starch digestion actually begins when the food is chewed in our mouth and it's mixed with saliva. Also lingual lipase. Lingual lipase is an enzyme that's activated by stomach acid and digests fat after the food is swallowed. There's also an enzyme that's found in saliva called lysozyme, which is also found in tears, that can kill bacteria. It helps break down the cell wall of bacteria, which makes it easier for our immune system to kill the bacteria. Also, there's immunoglobulins or antibodies. They're proteins that can inhibit bacterial growth and make it easier for our immune system to destroy bacteria. And then electrolytes. There's electrolytes and also bicarbonate that help to buffer the food that's in our mouth. Now, there's actually numerous small salivary glands called intrinsic salivary glands on our lips, the inside of our cheek, and also our tongue. These intrinsic salivary glands secrete small amounts of saliva whether we're eating or not. That's what helps to keep our mouth moist. But the main glands that produce the largest amount of saliva are called the extrinsic salivary glands. There's 3 pairs of these. They're located on each side of our head. The largest pair are the parotid glands, which are located just anterior to our earlobes on both sides of our head. Those release saliva through a duct into our oral cavity. There's also sublingual glands that are located underneath the base of our tongue that release their secretions through numerous ducts underneath our tongue. And there's also a submandibular gland, which is located just inferior to our mandible, that also releases its secretions through a duct. Then the next part of our digestive tract is the pharynx. The pharynx actually functions in both the digestive system as well as the respiratory system. Remember that the pharynx is divided up into 3 parts. The nasopharynx, which functions strictly with respiration. Then there's the oropharynx, which is posterior to the oral cavity. That functions in both digestion as well as the respiratory system, as air as well as food pass through the oropharynx. And then the inferior-most region of the pharynx is the laryngopharynx. Again, the upper part of the laryngopharynx functions in both digestion as well as the respiratory system. But towards the lower part of the laryngopharynx, that's kind of where the respiratory system veers off from the digestive system. And so that air goes down into the larynx, into the respiratory system, and then from the laryngopharynx, the food that we swallow goes down into the esophagus. Right, then the esophagus is a muscular tube that is lined internally with stratified squamous epithelium. It's mainly just a tube that transports food from our pharynx down to our stomach. So there's no no absorption of nutrients. There is some digestion that occurs there because of the enzymes that are found in the saliva that's mixed with our food. But the esophagus doesn't produce any enzymes itself. It's mostly just a passageway that allows food to travel down to our stomach. Now, the esophagus, along with our tongue and our oral cavity and pharynx, are all involved in the process of swallowing. And I have a little video here that shows the process of swallowing. There's a buccal phase, which starts out voluntarily when our tongue moves a bolus of food to the back of our throat, and then we swallow it. Then there's a pharyngeal phase, which is involuntary, and there's an esophageal phase, which is also involuntary. Now, hopefully, I can get this to play, and we can watch this video that goes through the process of swallowing. It's actually a fairly complicated process. It involves several of the cranial nerves, and it's actually controlled by a region of our brain.
Swallowing, or deglutition, is the process by which food passes from the mouth to the stomach. This movement is controlled by the nervous system and involves both voluntary and involuntary muscle contractions. Before food is swallowed, it is mechanically broken down in the mouth by chewing or mastication. The salivary glands secrete the enzymes lingual lipase and salivary amylase. Salivary amylase begins the chemical breakdown of starch, carbohydrates, in the mouth. The water content of saliva helps bind particles together to form a bolus that can be swallowed. Swallowing occurs in 3 stages. The first is a voluntary phase called the buccal or oral transit phase. Here the tongue moves upwards and backwards against the hard and soft palate to push the bolus into the oropharynx. Next is the pharyngeal stage, in which involuntary movements push the bolus through the pharynx and into the esophagus. Movement of the bolus stimulates receptors in the oropharynx, which send impulses to the deglutition center in the medulla oblongata and the lower pons of the brainstem. The brain signals the soft palate and uvula to close off the nasopharynx, and the epiglottis to seal off the larynx. This prevents the bolus from entering the respiratory tract. The upper esophageal sphincter relaxes to allow the bolus to move into the esophagus and contracts to reduce backflow into the pharynx. In the final esophageal stage, the bolus is pushed onward by peristalsis, a progression of involuntary wave-like contractions of the circular and longitudinal smooth muscles of the esophagus. As the bolus approaches the end of the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes and the bolus moves into the stomach. So, in summary, food moves from the mouth, through the oropharynx and esophagus, and then into the stomach.
All right, well, I hope you were able to stomach all of that information. So, anyway, let's move on then.
Swallowing or deglutition
Whoops. Okay. All right. So then the next part of the digestive tract is the stomach. And the stomach is kind of a J-shaped hollow organ that functions for storage of food as well as chemical digestion. And as you can see here, there are 3 different layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis layer of the stomach. The stomach is also divided up into different regions. So the upper part of the stomach that's adjacent to the esophagus is called the cardiac region. There's also an upper dome-shaped region up here. You can see it right here. Let me highlight this for you here. So here's the fundic region. That's right up here. This is the upper dome-shaped region. The cardiac region is over here, right where the junction is between the esophagus and the stomach. Then in the middle of the stomach, you have the body. That's called the body of the stomach. And then the lowest part of the stomach, which joins with the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, is called the pyloric region. So there's a sphincter muscle that closes off when food first enters the stomach, called the pyloric sphincter. There's also a cardiac sphincter. Cardiac sphincter opens up when you swallow food to allow the food to go down in the stomach. Once the food gets down in the stomach, then that closes off. That prevents stomach acid from getting up into the esophagus. So sometimes stomach acid does get up through the cardiac sphincter. If that occurs, then that's referred to as esophageal reflux. That's the technical term for it. The common term is heartburn. And esophageal reflux actually can be fairly dangerous if it's chronic, if it continues for a long time, because that acid can irritate the esophagus, and that sometimes results in esophageal cancer. So you want to be careful. If you have a lot of problems with heartburn, it's best to ask a doctor about it, because in the long run it can lead to a lot bigger problems, either ulcers, or sometimes it even results in esophageal cancer. Also, in addition to the parts that I've already mentioned, there are 2 different borders of the stomach. There's one border over here on this person's left side. That's called the greater curvature of the stomach. That's kind of the outer curvature of the stomach. And then there's a shorter, smaller, lesser curvature. So lesser curvature would be on the right-hand side of a person's stomach, on your right-hand side. The greater curvature would be on your left-hand side of the stomach. All right, now, if you take a look at a cross-section through the wall of the stomach through the microscope, you'll see that it has the same 4 layers as any other part of the digestive tract. There's a mucosa, there's a submucosa made up of blood vessels and connective tissue. There's a muscularis layer that's made up of 3 layers of smooth muscle, and then there's a serosa. That's a thin outer layer of connective tissue. The mucosa of the stomach, though, has very deep recesses called gastric pits. And the gastric pits contain specialized cells that, some of which secrete hydrochloric acid, which lowers the pH of the stomach contents, helps to break down our food. And it also kills things like bacteria that are ingested. And then there's other cells that secrete enzymes such as gastric lipase, and also proteolytic enzymes like pepsinogen, which is converted by the acid of our stomach into pepsin, which breaks down protein. So these gastric pits are shown here in this next slide. This is a artist's illustration of a gastric pit. The cells that line this produce things like hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, which is an inactive proteolytic enzyme that's converted to pepsin by hydrochloric acid. There's gastric lipase. There's also cells that secrete a hormone called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is really, really important because it's needed for our digestive tract to absorb vitamin B12. And that's important because vitamin B12 is necessary for our body to produce new red blood cells. So if a person doesn't have enough intrinsic factor, then that could lead to anemia because your body's not going to be able to produce enough red blood cells. So it's, well, if your body doesn't produce enough intrinsic factor, you're not going to be able to absorb enough vitamin B12, and so you're not going to be able to produce enough red blood cells because that can lead to anemia. So people that have insufficient intrinsic factor sometimes have to get injections of vitamin B12. Then also the gastric pits secrete a hormone called ghrelin. That's a hunger hormone. So that's a hormone that causes you to be hungry. All right. So the salivary and gastric enzymes partially digest protein and lesser amounts of starch and fat in the stomach. But most of the digestion and nearly all absorption of nutrients occur after the chyme, which is the mixture of enzymes and food, has passed into the small intestine. And then when that happens, secretions are added by the pancreas. So almost all the absorption occurs in the small nutrients, occurs in the small intestine, as well as most of the chemical digestion, because there's a large amount of enzymes that are added to the chyme by the pancreas. So you don't get much absorption of nutrients in the stomach or the esophagus, either one, because the mucosa is not really structured for absorption. All right, so the next part of this chapter is concerned with some of the accessory organs, such as the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Liver and the pancreas both produce secretions, which help to break down food. The gallbladder mainly just stores the secretions of the liver, which is referred to as bile. So the structure of the liver and also the pancreas is kind of complex. We probably don't have enough time to get through this next section, so this would probably be a good place for us to stop. So I think we'll stop here since we've got down through the stomach, and we'll finish this up then on Monday when we go down through the rest of the digestive tract. So we should be able to finish that up, and I may even be able to give you a short introduction on the reproductive system and lecture on Monday. So I hope you have a good weekend, and I hope you've learned something. Don't forget to do your Connect assignments. I'll make sure that the rest of the chapters are assigned so that you can get those completed, because we don't have much time left. We only have just a little over a week, and then we have finals. So this last part of the semester has really, really gone by fast, but I really appreciate the attention that you've had in class, and I think it's been a really, really good semester. So I really appreciate everyone's efforts in this class, because I know this is not an easy class. It's probably one of the harder classes there is to take in biology. All right, so I hope you have a good day, and I hope you have a good weekend. We'll see you later.